Achtung, Achtung, action this day. Welcome to We Have Ways of Making You Talk with me, Al Murray, and of course James Holland. And what have we got for you this Tuesday? Well, we like bunging you surprise guests and the unexpected, I think it's fair to say. Although if you run into this guy along the way, you'll know perfectly well there's nothing unexpected about this at all. James, who have we got?
We have got Dermot O'Leary. How about that, folks?
Hello, boys. How's it going?
Yeah, all good.
Well, you know.
Very nice to see you.
And you, very much. It's funny you say unexpected. I did Michael McIntyre has a new show. I was recording it the other day, and it's kind of a quiz show, game show thing. And the idea is that different people on camera or celebs or whatever you want to call us answer questions in their own specialist subject for punters. So the punter comes and says, right, I want to answer a question about food. And there's a chef there. And you spin it's called the wheel, and you spin the wheel, and hopefully it will land on the chef. And he had all these people there. Like Gokwan was there about fashion. Susie Dent was there about the English language. And it came to me, and I was World War II. And McIntyre was just slaughtering me whenever it came to me. He was like, what was it like going on the beaches in D-Day? And I was just, because they asked me to come up with something I'm passionate about. And that was all I gave them that. Or Prime Minister since 1945, or Shackleton. It was like for this primetime BBC One thing. So they were like, we're obviously going to have to take the wall. But luckily, I got all my questions right, thank God.
Well, you've come to the right place now, Dermot. I mean, we couldn't get got one this week. Where does your interest in the Second World War come from? Because when we've run into each other before, we've inevitably ended up talking.
Yeah, absolutely. The thing is, I've always loved history and politics, and politics was the only subject at school that I was really any good at, And then as I got older, sort of 15, 16, you actually realise that politics is really history. So where I grew up, my family had no real connection to the war because we were Irish. And actually my sort of great granduncle, they all fought in the Irish Civil War and the War of Independence and stuff. So I never had any connection from a family point of view. But then I grew up, when my parents came over in 68 and then they moved out of London to near Colchester. And so by an accident of birth, I grew up in the North Essex, South Suffolk, with these lovely big booming skies near all these old bomber airfields. So I grew up kind of going to air shows once or twice a year, whether it's Mildenhall or Duxford. So that was, and probably less so now, but at the time, in the 70s and 80s, that was kind of that kind of sense of history was still very living around that area, and it was sort of imbued in it. And then, like a lot of kids my age, I subscribed to that comic Warlord. Remember Warlord in the 70s? And then I had that for about a year. And then my dad sort of picked it up kind of like willy-nilly one day, read it and just went, I'm not letting you have this anymore. But it's like, it's so suspect. So that got cancelled. But I've always had this incredible interest in history and politics. And then I got to my late 20s and Band of Brothers came out. And around that time, and it was actually, obviously they're incredible pieces of work, but I sort of, it struck me that I was about 30 at the time, and I was born 30 years after the middle of the Second World War, and that just felt like you blink and you miss it. Really, it's just 3 decades, so it was just like 30 years ago I would have been in the thick of this. And I guess it grew sort of exponentially from there. And then I've just become a real keen amateur enthusiast. Really, I'm certainly no expert, but the more I read, the more I understand. And I think that's kind of how it's always been. And then I had the good fortune. Al, obviously, me and you have sort of met each other and interviewed each other and chatted many times down the years, and we always end up talking about it. Sadly, largely off air. And then I had the good fortune to work with James in 2015 on the Battle of Britain Day documentary, which is just still one of the things I'm most proud of, and also one of the things that still sort of interests me the most. And I think what I love so much about history, and Second World War history in particular, is the more you delve into it, the more you find. And you find these incredible... I've always fascinated by ordinary people doing extraordinary things in the most extraordinary of circumstance. And that for me that's the Second World War writ large. It's the stories of, I'm interested in the strategy and the tactics and the politics behind it all and all of that. But really, fundamentally, I'm a curious creature, and I love stories about people. And the Second World War, for obvious reasons, is just, and still we're finding finding out more and more now, these extraordinary stories and acts of heroism from just ordinary people who are put in this terrible, terrible situation.
Yeah. Well, which also ties into your feeling of, well, if I were 30, 40 years younger, it would have happened to me.
Yeah.
I think those two things are very, very closely related, very tangled up together in when you're looking at this as a piece of history. But I agree. I mean, the complexity and the sort of, someone the other day on the podcast used the word mosaic. It's more than that. It's a billion mosaics. Or we talked about it being like a pointillist painting, and you pull out, you can see a big picture, but you go in and it's made up of a billion dots. And from everyone's perspective, it's different as well. That's the other thing that's absolutely incredible about it.
Well, I think that's absolutely right. And it's just, what you're saying there, Dermot, is exactly the same feelings for me. I mean, for me, it's the more you delve into it, the more nuanced, the more interesting, the more kind of complex it becomes. So that in itself is interesting. But also that kind of human interest stuff. I mean, absolutely, it's the human interest that gets you going in the first place, because, basically it's like glorified gossip. Because if you sort of think that gossip is really being nosy about other people's affairs, that's what it is. And it is this... and it is absolutely the ordinary people doing extraordinary things. And if you think about the history of our planet, and if you think, particularly about, us here in Britain or in the United States or Germany or wherever in Europe, there is no other event that's happened that's had more human drama than the Second World War. And it really is wide-ranging. I mean, just as we were chatting beforehand, you mentioned Iceland and stuff, but, the fact that it really was truly global as well also makes it, very, very interesting, doesn't it? Because you're talking about kind of jungles to deserts, deserts to the Arctic to the kind of briny grey sea of the North Atlantic to the South Pacific, etc., etc., etc. And that's a hell of a breadth.
Well, it feels like something that could have only happened once and could never, and please God, could never happen again. Because just in the scale and in terms of the human endeavour, because if anything like that does happen again, it will be fought by drones, and it will be fought with technology, and it will be, cataclysmic. Whereas it felt like period that's, and I think the fact it's in living memory is still so important as well. So the fact that we've all had the good fortune of meeting, and I hear some interviewed on your on your podcast, and they're sort of my favourite episodes actually, is when you guys get someone on who was there, and you guys just sit back and light the touch paper and just let them go. But the fact it's in living memory, and the idea of preserving those the memories and those stories, and I don't know how you guys find it. It's really interesting now, having had the good fortune of meeting and interviewing a fair few veterans. Obviously, none of them seem to talk about it for about 20 to 30 years because they all had undiagnosed PTSD and they just went about their lives. Do you know what I mean? And that was the only way they could. And it just wasn't the done thing. And then, obviously, the appetite grew. But what... And I really wanted to talk to you about this, because it's something that I'm really fascinated with at the moment, is when you interview someone of that age and people that have been through that kind of such a visceral experience and have also done a fair few interviews. And I'm really thinking about Tom Neal when I ask this, is when I interviewed Tom and spent that summer with Tom Neal, which was a huge privilege, towards the end of the summer, when I got to know him a little bit better, and Tom was always a kind of more... austere, kind of prickly character than Jeffrey, wasn't he? Because Jeffrey, I adored both of them, but Jeffrey was very kind of Arrested Development. You could speak to Jeffrey at 93 and have the same conversation you would have had Jeffrey at 23, really. Do you know what I mean? It's like Jeffrey had this wonderful way of writing and talking, whereas Tom was very considered, and so you had to be probably a little bit more on point when you were talking to Tom. But I said to Tom, when I got to know him a little bit better, I said, look, with these memories, these stories I'm asking you, the memories, are they memories or are they memories of memories now? And he said, yeah, it's a really good question. So because I sometimes, when a lazy crew turns up and turns over, I go, and I don't necessarily go through the motions, but I tell them the story that I know I've told 101 times. He said, every now and again, I'll just get a lightning in the bottle moment. And I'll say, oh my God, I was flying over the Thames estuary, and I saw that Dornier, and I went after him, and I almost died. And I'm there going, my mind's just exploding. The fact you're even telling me this. Do you know what I mean? It's a really interesting.
I got to know them both 20 years ago, So,
That's interesting.
when I first met Jeff, I think he was still 79. So, a comparatively young old man. And obviously Tom was, 81 or something when I met him. I first interviewed him when I was doing my very first book, which was about the Siege of Malta. And, he'd been flying out there, flying Hurricanes in 1941. But funny thing is I actually found... Jeff and I really, really went back because I was very involved in getting his book published.
Of course, yeah.
Just by complete fluke and happenstance. But so he was always... I knew him before he was Jeff Wellham, author of First Light. I knew him when he was Jeff Wellham, kind of former fighter pilot, and everyone had forgotten about him. And he wasn't substantially different at all, I hasten to add. What I loved about Jeff, and I think you kind of touched on this, is that he just didn't give a shit. He didn't give a shit what people thought about him. And he didn't care. So he didn't care who he met. I mean, he might have been polite in front of the Queen or something and Prince Charles, but everyone else, he just told it as it was. And if he thought you were being stupid, he would tell you. And he just said what he felt like because he could, and he was very funny and irreverent. But Jeff absolutely stuck to a script, which was this kind of, he could only see it obviously through the prism of his own experiences, and everything else was what he'd read, and what he'd read had become absorbed into his memories a little bit. The difference with Tom is that Tom had really properly analysed his experiences, so he could talk about his own experiences, which he remembered, but he could talk about the bigger picture with a much greater level of objectivity than Jeff could. And I do remember him saying, and I was really stunned by this because I never ever heard this. And this then prompted a whole raft of really quite serious, proper archival research after what Tom had said to me. But I remember him saying to me, he said, the ME-109 could do the three things that you needed it to do. It could climb faster than a Spitfire, it could pack a bigger punch when you're in the combat zone, and it could die faster than a Spitfire. And that's all you needed to do. And I remember being really shocked by this at the time. And he must have told me this in sort of 2003 or something. And that prompted a whole load of research and looking into it. And you know what? He was damn right. He was absolutely spot on.
But that's because you're thinking, turning circle and all the stuff that was sort of that we all got as the sort of breast milk of the story of the Battle of Britain, isn't it? You're brought. The turning circle of the Spitfire's better, therefore it's superior. And he basically says no one's worried. Turning isn't the point.
Yeah.
That if you're into that situation, you're in trouble.
Yeah.
It's if you can dive quicker, that's the thing you really need to be able to do. And the stalling speed and all that sort of thing.
And the other thing, the other thing I just remember him saying is sort of, he had this wonderful thing of sort of leaning back on his shoulders when he was speaking. and
so true.
And I remember him saying, say to him, did you ever wake up during the Battle of Britain and not have enough Hurricanes at North Weald? And he said, no. He said, where they came from, how they arrived, angels in the night, who cares? They were there every morning. It was just absolutely amazing. He was just such good fun to be with.
Yeah,
and both of them were. Jeff was also, I mean, when I was down in Cornwall, which I used to go down to Cornwall every year, still do, but I mean, he lived in Mullion and we'd meet up and go to the local pub and have a pint and stuff. And
was he harbour master or something?
Yeah, he was for many years, yeah. Yeah. And, it was just great. And, and actually Jeff was the first ever Battle of Britain fighter pilot that I interviewed back in 2000. And I met him at his local pub in Mullion. And this was in the days when you could still smoke in a pub, so there were ashtrays there. And he picked up my pint and he picked up the ashtray and he goes, so here's me and my spit and here's this ME-109. And I'm just thinking, can I just bottle this up right now? Because this is what I imagine fighter pilots who've been through the Battle of Britain are like. And he was so brilliant, so much fun, so irreverent, so larger than life. I mean, he was just fantastic. And he never lost that kind of, that real sparkle.
Yeah. He did a talk at the Battle of Britain Club where that's the first and only time I met him. And this is an incredible story. So I sat next to this old gentleman called Eric Carter. Have you guys ever met Eric Carter? So Eric Carter was a kind of under the radar, slightly younger than the other guys, pilot who was too young at the time of Battle of Britain, ended up being part of Operation Archangel and the whole Force Benedict thing. And he starts talking to me about his time in the Arctic convoys and taking them the fighters over to Stalin and he flew up there. And I said to him at the end, I said, Eric, have you made any notes on that? And he just said, kind of very matter of fact, he said, no one will be interested in what I've got to say. And I went, hold my beer. And I was actually just emailed a buddy of mine the next day and went, you've got to meet this guy. And sure enough, 6 months later, Eric's working on a book and they get this book called Force Benedict's Public. It's really lovely.
Brilliant.
My favourite Tom story, I had to go up to... is it nearly? I think he lived near Beccles, so sort of Norfolk, Suffolk border.
Yes. He was right on. He was south of Norwich, wasn't he? Near Bungay.
So I'm going up with Matt Jones, who MD of the Boltby Academy, and we're sort of pitching this idea to him that we're going to do this documentary, and we're going to do this whole. Matt's going to take the next day all these spits and hurricanes, and that John's Blenheim, we're going to turn up to Goodwood, and we want him to be on side because it's going to be quite an exhausting summer for a 93-year-old guy at the time. So. I'm getting the train up to Norwich, and he lives between Norwich and Diss. But Matt tells me, I get to Liverpool Street, Matt's in the car and says, whatever you do, I said, I've fallen foul of this, don't get off at Diss and try and get a cab. He said, because you'll be late. And I was running late already, so I missed my train because of traffic. So I get on, and I was like, I cannot be late to meet this guy. I'm mortified. So I get on the train. And we hit Diss, and I'm looking at my phone, and I can see that his house is only 10 miles away from Diss and 30 miles away from Norwich. And I think, Matt's maths has got to be skewed. I've got to get off here. So I get off at Diss. The train pulls away. You may as well have seen Tumbleweed. I ran out and there were no cabs there. This isn't a small, it's not a village. It's a big enough town for there to be cabs at the station. And then I said to this old-fashioned kind of station master guy, I said, have you got any numbers for cabs? And he gave me 3. And I called the first one. He goes, oh, yeah, I can be there in an hour. I'm like, an hour? Where are you? I mean, what have you got to do in an hour? What are you talking about? So we finally get to Tom's house. I'm about half an hour late, and I get in, and do you remember he was having a little sort of semi nap, and he had those great kind of like really inquisitive, almost dancing eyes when and he always opened his eyes when he wanted to make a point. And I said to him, the first thing I said, because I got to know Patrick, his son, really well that summer, lovely man. And he said, listen, before he sort of give me a pep talk in the porch, he said, listen, before you go in and meet the old guy, if you, when you first address him, just address him as, I think it's Wing Commander, right? Yeah. When you first meet him, address him as Wing Commander. He said, listen, it's just, he'll correct you and he'll say, oh, don't be ridiculous, call me Tom. But the first time we meet him, just address him as Wing Commander. I'm like, I'm on it, I've got it, I'm done. So I walk into take my shoes off and I walk into the front room and I said, Wing Commander, I'm so sorry I'm late. I got off the train at Diss. I thought I'd get here on time. And then he was sort of half asleep and he went, well, why the devil would you do that? Diss, after all, it's bandit country. And it just fell apart. But the postscript to that is, I said to him, so I called him Wing Commander for the first time, thinking he'll correct me now. And he never corrected me for the first whole meeting. So I was there for like 4 hours and we had lunch together. So, and everyone else is calling him Tom. And I'm still at the dinner table thinking, I'm still not entirely sure. I'm like, Wing Commander, would you mind passing the wine? It's like, yes, of course. I'm like, when do I stop calling you Wing Commander and start calling you Tom?
Well, the really funny thing is that he had this wonderful wife called Eileen, and Eileen and him, they were married for such a long time. And she used to be she was in the RAF too. So when he was sort of being stern with her, he'd always call her section officer. But the funniest thing, that my favourite Tom Neal moment, there was 2 really funny stories with him. I've just got to tell them because they are really, really hilarious. The first one is when they did at the Imperial War Museum, they did this huge Cecil Beaton exhibit, Cecil Beaton's War. So they did all this exhibition, and it had, all the picture of Eileen Dunn with her little teddy bear in the hospital in Newcastle in the Blitz and all the rest of it, and the picture of St Paul's and all that. But one of the great big banners hanging down from the front was a picture of Tom by his Hurricane. And he walked up to the for one of the the sort of gallery opening. He walked up the steps at the Imperial War Museum under that kind of portico, and there were 2 women staring at the picture, and he just stood behind them and went, "Handsome devil, isn't he?"
Lovely.
And then the other one was when we were at the sunset dinner at Bentley Priory when it was being decommissioned. And honestly, that was one of the most memorable nights of my life. It was absolutely extraordinary. All the great and the good were there. All the surviving Battle of Britain pilots were there pretty much. And anyway, we all had champagne and stuff and drinks. It was all black tie and terribly grand. Everyone there with their gongs and stuff. And before we all settled down for the dinner, there was the Battle of Britain Memorial Flight came over and did this amazing display on the bit where you see Laurence Olivier in the film, right at the very end, on that kind of sort of bit overlooking sort of, on the hill overlooking London. And there they were in front of us. And Tom had just had a hip replacement, so he was in a wheelchair and he was stuck behind the pillar. And I said to Tom, well, do you want me to, do you want to move so you can see? And he said, don't worry, I think I know what they look like.
No, wonderful. Wonderful. He was handsome as well, wasn't he? Weirdly, I'm sort of rereading Scramble at the moment. And if you look, like, he had that kind of... Look at that, he had that great...
Yeah, that's the photo, the Cecil Beaton photo that was on the front of the Imperial War Museum.
Such a handsome guy. But I think what I love, and what I guess it's a microcosm to why I'm fascinated by the war itself. In one respect, you've got these two guys who can look back at their time... pretty objectively, and through this, so we've got this kind of human interest side, and actually what I always loved about both of them was they never resorted to kind of the lazy jingoism that you hear from so many people when they talk about the Battle of Britain. It's never, nothing's. I remember Tom telling me that. It's all about home field advantage, dear boy. He said, we were fine in the Battle of Britain because we had home field advantage and we had a very simple system. And I remember I was listening to one of the pods recently, and you guys were touching on the English, the British, the Allied supply chain was just so everything was so simple, whereas the Nazis just complicated so much. And he touched upon that. And he said, and yet when we got to Malta, we got clobbered because we didn't have home field advantage. And so there's a real objectivity that I always loved to him, that he never kind of like nothing was ever dressed up with kind of lazy jingoism or xenophobia or anything like that. And so I love the kind of human interest story. But then when you look at it kind of macro, there's this power play we sort of investigated in the documentary between Lee Mallory and Bader on one hand, and then you've got Park and Dowding on the other. And so this kind of the whole kind of big wing 11 versus 12 kind of a kind of debate, and actually you normally say to the victor belongs to spoils, but that wasn't the case at all with that in that instance, wasn't it? Because Park and Downing kind of were kind of pretty much bypassed, even though you could say they won the Battle of Britain. Would that be right, James?
Yeah. I mean, Lee Mallory was hopeless. I sort of, when you're writing about these people and you're looking into these people, you start with absolutely no axe to grind at all. I mean, I've got, on paper, I've got no beef with Lee Mallory at all. But the more I've looked into him and I've followed his career throughout the Second World War, I literally just can't think of anything that he did particularly well. I mean, he wasn't particularly, tactically, he was pretty rubbish. He was an awful kind of arse licker.
Well, that's the thing he was good at.
That's the one thing he was good at. But I mean,
that's his skill set, isn't it?
He was frightfully wet, really, particularly in the run up to D-Day, and he just wasn't very good. I just never quite understood. Particularly by the end of the war, you've really separated the wheat from the chaff, and generally speaking, the kind of the guys who've fallen short have fallen by the wayside, and you're left with people who are pretty competent on the whole. But he's an exception to that. I suppose the thing about Dowding is that Dowding should have retired twice already, and there is no question that he is physically and probably mentally exhausted by November 1940. He's been working around the clock, and his big challenge is no longer the day battle; it's the night battle, and there is a case for getting some fresh blood in it. But because Park is such a Dowding man, that if Dowding goes, really Park has to go too, particularly when his replacement is Sholto Douglas, which is why Lee Mallory then gets into that slot, because Lee Mallory is a Sholto Douglas man. So the decision was probably right to move Dowding on at that particular point, but it certainly wasn't handled well.
But for me, it's just, I know it's a lot easier said than done, but working on that documentary, it just sort of gave us the insight to the way Dowding and Park looked at it was to say, well, listen, we win the Battle of Britain by not losing the Battle of Britain. And so long as we don't lose, we win. I know that sounds ridiculous in its simplicity, but that's the fundamental truth, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
It is.
Well, that's what it comes down to. Is the German war machine? If you stop it, if you hold it up, time is the thing that it hasn't got. And if you make it waste time, if you make it spend time, it's done for. And that happens again and again and again and again throughout the war. It's that the British and then the Russians don't let them take their quick victories in the way that the French do, for instance. They work. If you hold them up, they're beatable because they haven't got time. Full stop. They don't have time for things to drag on. We're going to take a break now. We're talking to Dermot O'Leary.
There's a new epic of World War II out there. Sicily 43 by James Holland. It's about the epic 38-day battle that raged in July and August 1943. Oh, it's a story that involves breathtaking action at sea, in the air, and on land. Its conquest involved airborne operations, daring raids by special forces, the harnessing of the mafia, attacks across mosquito-infested plains, assaults up almost sheer faces of rock and scrub. Oh, and it features an astonishing array of highly colorful characters, and all to the backdrop of relentless heat, dust, and truly brutal terrain. Why, there's Patton, Monty, Tiger Tanks, Spitfires, and Messerschmitts. It's got the lot. And it's available now in all good bookshops in the UK, United States, and beyond. Perfect for Thanksgiving, Christmas, or just because it's the book you know you want to read. Grazie mille.
Welcome back to We Have Ways of Making You Talk. We're talking to Dermot O'Leary. What bone are you chewing on at the moment in terms of the Second World War? Because I get the feeling we could just talk about the Battle of Britain.
Yeah.
Forever, Dermot. But what other things are you gnawing
I tell you,
on?
I've recently, I've never really been an audiobook kind of guy, and but I've got into like a lot of Audible stuff. I'm doing a podcast for that at the moment, and so I end up sort of buying loads of credits, and because largely I tend to just read one book and then move on. And I've just actually finished a brilliant book about the 1916 uprising in Ireland by Tim Pat Coogan, who's the kind of foremost one of the great Irish historians, which is brilliant. It's great.
He was a lovely chap. I worked alongside him at one point. He was
never
fantastic. Actually, I'm just very quickly. I remember being at Heathrow once, and they said, we were going up on a flight from London to Edinburgh. And they said, have you got anything to declare? And he said, oh, nothing, just a wee bit of Semtex. It went down really bad.
But it's a really well-rounded book, and he's incredibly objective. So I've just finished that, but actually, I also have it as a book. But I just thought, you know what, I'll start maybe a month or two ago. I started it, and I just tend to listen to it while I'm cooking or. If I'm off for a walk with the baby and stuff, the Jonathan Dimbleby Battle of the Atlantic book, which I'm really, really enjoying, because it's kind of like the unsexy, the cruelty notwithstanding, it's kind of the unsexy, like you said, kind of grey, unrelenting, pretty horrifying side of the tonnage wars. It's kind of who wins the war in many ways. Correct?
Oh, completely.
Yeah.
It's the most important. It's the most important theatre of the war. Full stop.
Yeah.
Because none of the exciting things that none of the hillsides you can stand on in Normandy are possible if you've not won the Battle of the Atlantic. None of those places that are nice to visit. I mean, the middle of the Atlantic, no one wants to. You can't do a battlefield tour there, can you, James? You can't say
no. That's the point.
Next to this wave here is where the.
Well, I mean, just say you want to get, you want to sort of, maybe you're doing a battlefield tour of the Battle of the Bismarck and the Hood, and you sort of go, okay, right, I'm now looking on my compass. This is exactly the spot where the Hood went down. All around you, what you've got is just grey Atlantic forever, and you sit there and you go, wow,
yeah,
right, better get back to Ireland then, or Liverpool. Exactly. I mean,
But it's another micro to macro. I just finished reading a book a while ago, and I do want to talk to you about the Battle of the Atlantic, but this is kind of related to that, and kind of related to ordinary people put in extraordinary circumstances. Now, you'll have to forgive me, I'm not going to remember too many of the names, but it's called 12 Desperate Miles by a guy called Tim Brady, I think is the name of the author. And the story is, I can run and get it if you want. It's just upstairs in sort of bookshelves and library, but it's essentially the story of a French Moroccan patriot who is a river pilot, and he has to get squirreled out of French Morocco through Spanish Morocco up to I think Gibraltar, that's it, where he then gets taken over to America to then help navigate the fleet to land in Africa
for Torch.
Right, and he is the only guy who knows how to get up these 12 miles of river to where this German airfield is for them to capture the German airfield. So he's the river pilot, and he gets smuggled out by these two USS, what is it, OSS guys, I guess, or
OSS, yeah.
In the back of in the boot of like the Chevrolet or something that he's
How amazing.
I mean, the story it blew my mind, and then and then they also have to find, it's a kind of like double narrative. So they have to find a boat that is shallow enough in its draft to get up the river. So they find this old banana boat, and then they realise they've got no one to crew it. So then they kind of trawl these Louisiana jails for people who have got these kind of like small time crims who have got who've got any sailing experience, and then they give them all amnesties and bung them on the boat. So you've got this kind of, I mean, it's a terrific story. It really is.
God, that would make a good film, wouldn't it?
Yeah, absolutely.
12 Desperate Miles.
12 Different Miles, yeah, it's terrific. But I mean, the Battle of the Atlantic is fascinating for me because, once again, you've got the unbelievable... You've got this politics of Churchill on one side and Dönitz and Raeder and kind of knocking on Hitler's door on the other. Dönitz seemed like... No one seemed to be listening to that guy, and he was just saying, "Look, give me more U-boats, and I can finish this." Right?
Yeah, that's exactly what
he was doing that before the war, and that
Yeah.
he was absolutely bang on the money. I mean, they desperately needed more. There's no point in them building a surface fleet at all because it's never going to rival the US or the Soviet Union or Japan or France or Britain. I mean, and certainly particularly not Britain. I mean, just not in a million years. So if you're never going to be able to compete with Britain and the Royal Navy, what's the point? The only thing that can compete and can make a big difference is vast numbers of U-boats. The biggest problem about having a small U-boat fleet in 1939 when the war breaks out is you haven't got U-boat crews. So you haven't, when you suddenly do want to expand it in 1941, late 41, 42, to serious numbers, you haven't got that wealth of experience to spread through your newly expanding U-boat fleet. And that's a major, major problem as you're going into 1942 and 1943. And so it comes to pass. I mean, so he was absolutely spot on. But Hitler's a landlubber. He's a continentalist. He doesn't really understand naval power.
Well, and also he's doing it. A lot of the rearmaments PR anyway, and a big sexy battleship that is competing with British ships like the Hood and dreadnoughts is good PR in a way that a U-boat isn't. It's willy waving, isn't it? It's as much as it's anything else.
It is. It absolutely is.
I mean, the story of the Tirpitz is fascinating, isn't it? Because it did practically nothing and just sat in that Norwegian fjord for so long. But by just being there, it did. It's in many ways, it just scared the Allies so much that it kind of almost fulfilled its purpose. And then there's that great story. I was reading a book about it. It was Patrick Bishop book, I think. I was reading this great story about it where this reconnaissance Spitfire is flying up 20, 30,000 feet, thinks it spots it, takes some pictures, flies back. This poor pilot is running on empty, is on fumes, is thinking, I'm just going to have to ditch, I don't know where I am, and then just sees a break in the clouds and just, I don't care where that is, I'm going to go land there. I think it's somewhere like Orkney. Gets to Orkney and then gets back and he finds the Tirpitz. And that's another reason why I'm fascinated by it, because it's turned on so much of it is dictated by incredible planning and strategy, and yet there are these other instances that it's kind of turned on a sixpence serendipity. Yeah,
and you do need one guy to see something with his eyes and get back and report it. I mean, the Tirpitz is a really good point. The sheer sort of distraction of it. For Allied effort, but the Allies are capable of that too. Is the other thing. It just shows how deep their resources are. They could put all that effort into one ship, into dealing with one ship. Shows the sheer material and mechanical advantage that the Allies have.
No, I tell you one of the reasons why I'm enjoying the book as well is I've got a sort of mixed relationship with Churchill, but I'm full of admiration in certain things for him. And just the way he literally did not let up on Roosevelt. He just didn't stop, did he? It was just like, and by the end of it, it's like, give me the destroyers, give me the old destroyer. And every opportunity he possibly had, he was just in his ear all the time. And Roosevelt, it obviously looked like he wanted to join the war, but he had, America was kind of going down the isolationist route, and he had so many battles to fight, and he had to be very canny the way he went about it. But he was just, I mean, it's such a cliche thing to say, but Churchill was just such a bludgeoner. He just had such energy, didn't he? He just never stopped.
Well, you could see why the demand he made of the country was to not surrender, never give up, because that's what he wasn't doing. So all he's saying is do what I'm doing. I mean, it is amazing, that sequence of telegrams where he tries to be emollient, he tries to be blunt, he tries to be sort of imperious. It basically tries absolutely everything. I mean, it's like it's. Does it look desperate? I don't know. You could see it as that, and maybe from the American perspective, that's part of the problem, isn't it? It does look a little desperate, and he drives quite an easy bargain in the end, doesn't he? He gives up quite a lot in the end because he is pretty desperate. But it is that you're absolutely right. He is completely dogged and will not give up. Once he's got the Americans involved, he has sort of quite high expectations of them. Which are possibly misplaced.
Yes.
And because there's a whole slice of the American establishment thinking, brilliant, we get to dismantle the British Empire, we get to replace the British Empire, anything we can do to get that over the line, we'll take. And that he's also up against that. And, that the way that the power relationships change, particularly after the middle of 43, when it's, when obviously, I mean, we talk about this all the time in the podcast, when obviously the die is totally cast by the middle of 43, it's only a matter of time. It's only a matter of more enormous battles, but battles. It's only a matter of getting the thing done. And the power begins to slide away from Churchill. Yeah. And the way he handles that is really interesting because by the end of the war, we're on the Security Council, and we're still Great Britain's still a superpower and all that sort. In fact, Great Britain's the first country to be called a superpower in 1944. That the word's coined for the UK, which is really, or for the British Empire. Right? And then by 1946, the Attlee government can't afford butter.
Yeah.
It's the most extraordinary thing.
The book and actually what I'm learning about the Battle of the Atlantic is a microcosm as to why I love history so much, and actually the losses were just horrific on both sides. But I remember for the radio, we did a lovely show called Minute by Minute, and the first one we did was 100 years after the Titanic went down, and we went on air on Radio 2 because it's Greenwich Mean Time, so we went on air pretty much about an hour, maybe half an hour before the Titanic hit the iceberg, and we stayed on air and we recounted what happened minute by minute. We had music and we told the story, and then we came off air about 3:00, so about half an hour after the Titanic went down, and obviously the loss of life was horrendous, and and that's a story that is handed down from generation to generation, and because it was the first journey of its kind, and it was the maiden voyage, and it was kind of man's kind of hubristic view of battling nature. The stories in the Battle of the Atlantic, the losses in the Battle of the Atlantic, that Dimbleby just kind of goes, and the ship went down with 5,000 souls. It blows your mind. The losses were horrific, and I cannot think of a worse way to die.
Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting because in terms of statistics of the Battle of the Atlantic, it depends on which way you look at it. I mean, 85% of convoys got through unscathed. So but of course, naturally, everyone focuses on the 15% that didn't, because that's where there's the most drama, and you're absolutely right. It's a horrific way to go. Out of 383,000 individual shippings in the Second World War, I think it was 7,500 are sunk. So that means only 0.4% are sunk.
Yeah, astonishing success story.
But of course, that's a slightly skewed statistic, because if you look at British losses, merchant shipping was 2,452, which was roughly 25% of what it started with, because we had about 10,000 ships in the beginning. So 1 in 4 is actually quite a lot. And of course, of those 383,000 shippings, each ship is doing multiple shippings unless it happens to be sunk on its first run. So it doesn't quite follow. But I think, just to go back to kind of the fact that the hidden history of the Battle of the Atlantic, one of the things I think is really, really interesting, because it's not at the forefront, because our narrative of World War II tends to focus predominantly on the land battle. We see kind of 1940 and 1941, with the exception of the Battle of Britain, which is seen as very much as a defensive battle anyway, as a series of failures of kind of Britain kind of being slow to wake up and all the rest of it. When in actual fact, you could argue that actually 1941 is a year of terrific success, because, we clear the Suez Canal, and that's a problem. With East Africa, that's sorted. That's not a problem anymore. And also we get to a point by May 1941 where we're not going to lose the Battle of Britain. We don't win it for another 2 years, but we're not going to lose it after May 1941. And the reason is because of the huge research and development that is going into anti-submarine warfare. So, there are huge developments, and the absolute priority in terms of technological advancement is in the Battle of the Atlantic and in naval operations. It's just that we don't see that, and we don't see that coming. So everyone, Al knows that I'm always banging on about the cavity magnetron, but I mean, that is one example, and that is what enables us to reduce radar from something that's sort of next to Dover and 270 foot high in lattice to something that can fit on a Liberator or Wellington or on a destroyer, and that is a total game changer. And right up until the end of the Second World War, the Germans don't know that we've invented that, and so they're operating blind. Advancements in radio, HFDUF, high frequency direction finding, all that kind of stuff. The organisation of Western approaches is just amazing. It is this sort of we've got this eye on every single shipping movement in the world all the time, operating from Western Approaches command post up in Derby House in Liverpool. And it is those kind of developments that are enabling us to get into a situation where we're not going to lose by May 1941, and that is really, really important. And yet we don't appreciate that because we're worrying about the kind of losses of Crete and and Greece and failures in the desert and all that.
I haven't really got to the bottom of, I suppose, in the book, is why we were so slow to take up the convoy system. Because the convoy system was obviously hugely successful when they did start it, but Churchill was quite reticent to take it up to start with. And similarly, on the other side, Hitler was reticent we've touched on this a little bit earlier, was reticent to invest that much in U-boats and wanted sort of a big surface fleet. And Churchill was all about these surface raiders going to intercept, and actually they worked out that the convoy system was far more economical and advantageous.
Well, it's because it's difficult to organise for a start, isn't it? It's complicated. You have a problem when a convoy arrives in harbour is that, not ports are normally just ticking over. If a convoy arrives,
that's
it's a much bigger logistical issue. So if you can not disrupt things as much as possible, I think that's the main thing that holds up the decision, isn't it? Is that
and it's also the knowledge that the U-boat fleet is really small.
Yeah. They think they're going to get away with it basically, and not have to run in convoy. And it's also that kind of admission that you can't carry on as normal, isn't it? Because after all, the phony war, there very much is a kind of, the Chamberlain government's very much running things along the lines of, if we could just carry on as we are, really, as best we can, the Germans are going to give in any minute. They're going to realise it's not worth it. The blockade will work, and we don't need to change too much because we're ready as we are. And there's arguably a fundamental lack of seriousness until May 1940 in some of the British establishment, I think. Churchill's kind of the exception because he's trying to invade Norway before Christmas 1939. The thing about the Norway expedition is the delay rather than more than anything else. He's trying to get that off the ground as soon as the war starts, and the French and Chamberlain ums and ahs because he doesn't want to do anything provocative that might set the Germans off, which just when you think about it with hindsight just seems so bonkers.
He's such a victim of hindsight, isn't he?
Yeah, he is.
We just tracked. I know how long have we been talking now? I talk all day, but I don't know. But we just touched on Norway, and my father-in-law was now in his late 80s, and he was alive. He was about 10 or 13 or something in occupied Norway, in occupied Oslo. So he's a great wealth of stories because he was. It's really interesting to speak to someone who lived through occupation, and they drew lots when he was like 8 or 9. They drew lots they knew where the prisoners were. I think it was British airmen or prisoners after the botched invasion were being held, and they had their lunch and they went down and they sort of, all the boys chucked in, I don't know, just a piece of rye bread or a bit of cheese or something, and then they realised they had to distract the German soldier so they had a bit of a diversion so they could chuck the lunch over to the guys waiting in the exercise. And my father-in-law, had got the short straw, so he had to go and tell his German soldier to F off. The German soldier starts chasing him around the corner, and then the lads are able to chuck the thing over. Have you guys been to Oslo at all?
Yeah, I have, and I love Norway.
Just a
love
great-
Norway, love the Norwegians. It's an amazing place.
Wonderful place and great people. But there's the Defence Museum there. It's a brilliant museum, of the Resistance Museum up on the castle, overlooking kind of Akerbrygge.
Yeah, it's great, isn't it?
And we were in there with him. And a couple of years ago, my mum and dad came over to do a tour of Norway, and so there's a family. We were in there looking around. I really wanted to take them there because, for me, it just they're kind of define the Norwegians by sort of modern Norwegians are defined by sort of 200 years of independence from Sweden. So they have a great Independence Day on the 17th of May, and also they're very much defined by the war. Yeah. And to the point where my father-in-law was telling me when the Germans first came in, and you can see the fort, the old fort there. The first ship came in, and the Norwegian this kind of land battery just like opened up on it and went straight down.
Sank it, didn't it?
Yeah, and so, but there's a whole generation of old Norwegians that still won't eat mackerel because they call it the German fish, because the mackerel just went down and obviously like feasted on the corpses. Yeah, ate them all. Yeah, so there was a generation of people that wouldn't eat, even though they're like going through these really like pre-oil discovery and gas discovery. They're going through these really harsh winters, and they're a nation of farmers. But a whole generation of people that won't touch mackerel. He was telling me, but it's like no, it's a German fish. So we're in the Norwegian Resistance Museum, and there's this terrific wall at the end where you walk out, and there's a picture of a sort of photograph on the wall superimposed, like sort of as big as the room, of I guess what is the celebration of independence, in the same way when de Gaulle came back into Paris. It's like obviously has the King of Norway, and the flags and ticker tapes are out, and this American tourist was in there. We came out and she went, gee, it looks unbelievable. And Raw, my father-in-law, said, yes, it was. And she turns around and she goes, what? He goes, well, I'm up there on the left. I'm just out of earshot. He was just like, and the whole museum was like these kind of like American tourists, just like, what? And just sort of chatting to
it's amazing. Yeah. I was lucky enough to go around that museum with Gunnar Sternsteby, who was one of the, along with Max Manus, was one of two of the great resistance heroes of Norway, and Norwegian resistance was pretty successful actually. And I remember Gunnar was saying that they went out of their way not to kill Germans. They used it as intelligence. They thought that their role was purely sabotage and intelligence gathering and nothing else. And it was kind of interesting how they went about it. But
what is amazing, very Norwegian Scandinavian way to look at it as well. It's very
okay
economical. This is what's going to get us the best results. This is how we'll do it.
And he got away with it, he said, because he had this incredibly boring, bland face that had no distinctive features whatsoever. So he was able, he just passed by in a crowd, no one noticed him. But what is amazing is also he's just south of of that rather cool international airport, all made of wood. Are all these woods, and out there is a tank firing proving ground. So you've got, this is where the Germans have their tanks and they'd fire their guns and make sure they're all working, whatever. And in the woods, just to the right of this proving ground, is where they would execute people, execute resistors, and the first British glider men that came down in what was it, Operation Grouse, isn't it? And they do it there because the guns and the sound of the guns and the tanks would hide the sound of the MP40s mowing these people down. And there's all these little graves in the woods. It's really, really weird. It's like, here's where 5 resistance guys were executed. Here's where 5 British guys were. Here's where 2 guys were. And it's really, really eerie. It's really, really odd place.
Yeah. No, because northern France is a little bit like that. More in the First World War, isn't it? With the battlefield cemeteries, where the first tour I did over there, you just realise, because you see these vast cemeteries for the Second World War when you could repatriate and move bodies probably a lot easier. And obviously the American one is the one that stands out to memory. But in those First World War tours where you're going back, and there'll literally be a field there, and there'll just be like 50 graves there or 10 there, and that's so stark.
Well, Dermot, we could do this all afternoon.
This is so much fun.
We'll come back again.
Well, we'll get you back again. We'll get you back again at some point. But thanks very much for talking to us, and carry on winning that battle of the Atlantic.
Absolutely.
Thank you, guys. I really enjoyed it.
That's a real pleasure. Dermot O'Leary, thank you very much. Thanks for listening, everyone. We'll see you next time. Cheerio.
Cheerio.